The Pacific night was thick and endless black waves rolling under a bruised sky. Aboard the U.S. Navy cruiser USS Helena, every sound was routine until it wasn't. At 0200 hours, a metallic shriek tore through the hull, followed by a deep cough from below. The turbine sputtered once, twice, and then silence. The ship drifted in dead water, steam hissed like a dying animal, men froze mid-motion, staring at gauges that had flatlined. "Shut her down," an officer barked, his voice cracking against the clatter of failing valves. The entire engine room glowed hellish orange under emergency lights. Oil dripped from overhead pipes. The air smelled of burnt metal and salt. For a crew of 800, this wasn't just a malfunction, it was a death sentence. They were 200 miles from the nearest friendly ship, somewhere between the endless nothing of the Pacific and the invisible reach of enemy submarines. One engineer slammed his fist against the control panel, powers gone, main drive seized, the captain's face turned to stone. A 14,000-ton cruiser immobile in enemy hunting grounds, it was like waving a red flag at the sea. Above deck, the ship's movement slowed to a sickening crawl. Even the ocean seemed to mock them with its rhythm. Men whispered about torpedoes, about ghosts in the water. Below, in the furnace heat of the engine bay, every breath tasted of fear and oil. Then came the quiet, the kind that makes time stretch thin. Only the ticking of cooling pipes, the drip of condensation. The captain knew what it meant. If the ship stayed still, it would be found. If found, it would die. Years later, a Japanese submarine commander would recall in his log, "We saw the cruiser stop. If she stops, she sinks." But somewhere in that suffocating silence, a young mechanic pushed his way through the crowd. His uniform was stained, his face streaked with soot, and a dented toolbox swung from his calloused hand. The officers barely noticed him, just another enlisted grease monkey. He looked once at the dead engine, then back at the men arguing over manuals. "Sir," he said quietly, "I think I can fix it." Nobody believed him, not yet, but the sea didn't wait for belief. They called him Cornfield, because he smelled like engine grease and Iowa dust. 22 years old, brown hair matted from sweat, the kind of face that looked out of place on a warship. He wasn't supposed to be here. He'd fixed tractors, not turbines, drafted, trained for 6 months, then dropped into a floating city of brass and steam. The Navy didn't see an engineer. They saw a farm boy with steady hands and an accent that didn't belong on the coast. He squatted beside the dead turbine, eyes scanning the tangle of pipes and valves. Others saw chaos. He saw a broken rhythm. Pressure feeds choked. He muttered more to himself than anyone. An officer snapped, "You don't talk unless spoken to." But Cornfield wasn't listening. His mind was already miles away back home, under a sky thick with cicadas, fixing a combine that coughed just like this. The manuals said one thing, reality said another. 12% of Navy mechanics had ever studied real engineering. The rest trained to follow checklists, not instincts. Cornfield's instincts were older than any blueprint. He touched the side of the turbine, feeling its pulse, or what used to be one. "Sir, if we reroute from the auxiliary line, we might relieve the pressure lock," he said. The chief engineer laughed. "You think you can outsmart the manual, Farmboy." Cornfield just shrugged. "Back home, you don't have manuals when the tractor dies mid-harvest. You got one shot before the field's lost." His hands moved without hesitation, checking valves, loosening bolts, studying residue patterns like a detective. The other men stopped mocking when they saw how fast he worked. No wasted motion, no guesswork, just calm, deliberate focus. From somewhere deep in his memory, he remembered how his father once fixed a busted irrigation pump, using only wire, oil, and common sense. That memory glowed like a lantern inside him now. Across the ocean, a German POW later wrote, "Americans send farmers to fix engines. Madness." He didn't understand. That was the advantage. Above deck, the captain hesitated. They were losing time and the Farmboy was their last chance. The officer gave a curt nod. "Do what you need." Cornfield smiled slightly, rolling up his sleeves. "Then let's get her breathing again." And as he reached for the soaked blueprints, the sea growled louder, mocking the idea of rules. The blueprints were soaked through pages curling, ink bleeding into blue-grey mush. Cornfield flipped them open anyway, but the diagrams had dissolved into sea stains. The manual said the repair needed a dry dock, specialized tools, and a week. They had none of that. What they had was salt water in the air, steam in their lungs, and death creeping closer under the waves. He spread the ruined pages on the deck, then tore them apart. The officers gasped, but Cornfield didn't flinch. He sketched the pump from memory, drawing lines with a grease pencil straight onto the metal bulkhead. "We don't need the manual," he said. "We just need flow." The men watched as he turned the massive wheel, valve counterclockwise, listening not to the hiss but to the rhythm inside the pipe, like a doctor feeling for a heartbeat through skin. The boiler was bleeding steam at 96 degrees Celsius, losing nearly 3 gallons of pressure water every second. The engine should have been dead hours ago, but Cornfield had grown up fixing things that weren't supposed to live. He cut through a corroded pipe with a hacksaw, sparks flying like orange fireflies, the air thick with the stench of burned oil and fear. He traced the fault line with his finger. "One hairline crack no thicker than a pencil lead. Here's your culprit," he said. The chief engineer frowned. "That's impossible to weld under pressure." Cornfield looked up, eyes steady. "Not impossible, just stupid, but stupid can work." Every sound in the engine room magnified the creak of metal, the throb of generators failing one by one. The ship drifted another mile, helpless. Somewhere up top, radar men scanned the horizon for enemy subs. Reports from captured Japanese engineers after the war described the moment perfectly. They improvise like they've done it before. We could not understand their courage. Cornfield didn't feel brave, he felt cornered. He wiped the sweat off his neck, then called out, "Get me welding torches, and tell everyone else to clear this space." His voice carried weight now, not request command. The crew scattered. The flicker of torchlight filled the belly of the cruiser like lightning in a storm cloud. He took one last breath, knowing he had only minutes before pressure collapse. The cruiser rocked hard as a wave slammed against its hull. Above deck, the lookout shouted coordinates, enemy radar pings. A Japanese submarine was in range. Below, in the sweltering dark of the engine bay, Cornfield didn't even look up. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, "We've got company." He tightened the torch valve, flame hissing alive. The air shimmered in heat waves. The crack in the turbine flange gleamed faintly. Metal expanding like it was breathing pain. He had maybe 30 minutes of torch gas left after that. There'd be no second chance. "Everyone clear," he yelled. The crew backed off, covering their faces. Sparks rained down as he welded the crack with scavenged brass fittings ripped from old plumbing lines. The temperature hit 600 degrees Fahrenheit. The smell of scorched oil and ozone burned the lungs. Each weld bead popped and hissed under pressure, and still he worked, steady as a metronome. Above, sonar pings grew faster. The sub was closing. Officers debated, fight or flee, but neither was possible without power. The ship's body groaned under stress, as if the ocean itself was testing their will. Cornfield's shirt was soaked through, but he didn't notice. He braced his arm against the turbine, using the torch like a scalpel, sealing the wound inch by inch. The metal roared, then sighed. "That's it," he muttered, voice barely audible. "Don't die on me now." The chief engineer crouched beside him, eyes wide. "You're going to melt it clean through." Cornfield grinned through the sweat. "Then we'll know where it's weakest." The welding arc flared brighter, reflections dancing across the steel walls like ghost fire. Somewhere in the chaos, someone began humming a tune. Nervous habit, a scrap of calm in the inferno. A Japanese machinist captured later would admit, no engineer would attempt it. They act like they have no fear of failure. But it wasn't fearlessness. It was desperation wrapped in determination. The final weld hissed, then cooled. Cornfield shut off the torch, breathing hard. The engine room fell into tense silence. Everyone stared at the molten seam, glowing orange against the steel. The ship creaked once more, like an animal deciding if it wanted to live. Then, deep in the hull, a long metallic groan rolled upward. The sound of pressure returning. At first, no one dared move. The air was thick smoke, heat, and disbelief hanging together like fog. Cornfield stood frozen, torch still in his hand, waiting for a sign. Then, with a low rumble, the gauges began to twitch, one needle, then another. The ship seemed to inhale after drowning. Pressure rising, shouted the chief engineer. The men rushed to their stations, eyes glued to the panels. Steam hissed softly at first, then with growing confidence, the great heart of the cruiser began to thump again. A single rotation of the propeller shaft echoed through the deck plates, a hollow boom like a heartbeat restarting. From the bridge, the captain's voice cracked through the calm helm report. "Sir, we've got movement." A cheer ripped through the ship's gut, echoing from metal to muscle. Men pounded on the bulkheads, laughter breaking through exhaustion. Cornfield leaned against the railing, chest heaving, face lit by the trembling light of reawakening gauges. One gauge read 1-2, 100 psi barely half of normal, but enough to crawl forward at 10 knots. It wasn't victory, but it was life. They were moving again, slowly, defiantly. The black waves around them churned as the cruiser clawed through the sea, smoke trailing like a scar across the night. Reports later described it simply: reactor power regained, propulsion partial. But that entry hid the human miracle behind it. A 14,000-ton ship brought back from death by a man with calloused hands. Somewhere hundreds of miles away, a Japanese signal officer logged an observation. Their ships resurrect themselves. Cornfield didn't hear that, of course. He only felt the vibration beneath his boots, the steady rhythm of survival. Yet even as the ship crawled forward, he knew the weld was temporary. The flange was still under strain. Any surge could split it wide open again. He knelt, pressing his ear against the metal. Beneath the hum, he could hear it, the faint tick of stress fractures forming. The engine wasn't fixed, it was fighting to stay alive. Cool it down evenly or it'll blow, he warned. But the coolant tanks were dry. The men exchanged looks, hope fading back into fear. Cornfield exhaled through his teeth, already thinking. "Then we'll make our own coolant," he muttered, and that's when he asked for buckets. When Cornfield shouted for buckets, the engine crew thought he'd lost it. The idea sounded insane cool, a high-pressure turbine with seawater. But the man who just resurrected their cruiser had earned a moment of faith. The captain's voice came through the comms, tight but calm. "Whatever he needs, give it to him." Men scrambled up the ladders, filling every container they could find, canteens, metal bins, even coffee pots. Salt water sloshed down the stairwells as they formed a line, shoulder to shoulder, passing buckets hand to hand like a human pipeline. The engine room turned into a furnace. Steam rolled across the floor, boots slipping, the smell of scorched brass stinging their noses. Cornfield shouted over the roar, splash in rhythm steady, not too much. The crew followed his count, 1-2, throw. 1-2, throw. Every splash hissed like an angry serpent. The metal screamed under the sudden chill, blisters of steam exploding around their legs. The thermometer needle trembled, falling degree by degree. Each man took turns, hands blistered, eyes red from heat and salt. 3,000 gallons of seawater were dumped manually, an act of madness turned into discipline. Someone laughed through the chaos. Someone else started singing a half-drowned tune about home. It spread, cracked and off-key, but it kept their rhythm alive. Cornfield watched the weld's color shift. From orange to dull grey, the seam held. Against every law of physics, it held. The engine's pulse steadied, slow but loyal. From an observer POW later transported to the U.S. A note read, "Discipline in chaos. They joke while burning." that line would never leave Cornfield. Because that was exactly what it was, men burning but still laughing, still fighting, still refusing to break. When the gauges stabilized, Cornfield leaned against the valve casing, chest heaving. "That's it," he whispered. "She's cool enough." The chief engineer clapped him on the back. "You just bought us a night, Farmboy." But before relief could settle, the radar alarm shrieked. Above deck, the sound was sharp enough to freeze every man mid-breath. The captain's voice thundered through the speaker. "Enemy contact bearing 097. Cornfield's eyes lifted toward the deck ceiling. He knew what that meant. They'd fixed the engine just in time for a fight. The radar's shrill cry sliced through the air like a knife. On the bridge, the captain's knuckles whitened around his binoculars. Japanese submarine closing fast. The officer of the deck reported. Down below, every man went rigid. The engine they'd just revived now beat like a terrified heart, still too weak to sprint. Cornfield wiped sweat from his face with a trembling sleeve. "If we can't move, we're target practice," someone muttered. The room went quiet. Everyone knew the Math torpedo range was 5,000 yards. They wouldn't see it coming, just one bright flash and the sea swallowing them whole. The captain's voice cracked over the intercom. "We need propulsion now." Cornfield knelt by the gauge panel, scanning dials that fluttered just below safety. Pressure at 900 psi, temperature holding but the weld was straining. Push it too hard and the flange could explode, ripping through the entire compartment. He chewed his lip, thinking. On sonar, the pings grew closer. Boom, 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 each one a heartbeat from death. "Enemy thinks we're dead in the water," said a radar tech, whispering like it mattered. Cornfield glanced up. "Then let's surprise him." He turned back to the control manifold. His voice was steady but low. "We'll need to vent auxiliary steam through line 3, redirect pressure to port turbine." "That'll overload the junction," the chief warned. Cornfield shrugged. "Better we blow a pipe than die waiting." Up above, the crew prepared depth charges just in case. The destroyer escort radioed, "We've got one contact moving toward you." Suggest evasive. Evasive, they could barely move. A Japanese sub-lieutenant would later write, "We thought she was finished, easy target." Cornfield's mind ran faster than the ticking radar. He reached for the bridge intercom, and for the first time his voice carried authority. "Captain, give me 5 minutes." 5 minutes. That was all he needed. The captain paused, silent for a beat that felt eternal. Then came the reply, "You've got them. Don't waste a second." The ship tilted slightly as a wave slammed its side, echoing through the decks. The sound blended with the metallic breathing of the reborn engine, like two hearts trying to sink. Cornfield adjusted his grip on the valve wheel. Time was dissolving. The stopwatch on the bulkhead started ticking 5 minutes. That was all the time between survival and the sea turning into their grave. The engine room felt smaller with every second. Sweat dripped from the ceiling, steam hung in sheets, and Cornfield's shadow flickered across the walls as he worked. He barked orders with the precision of a man who'd stopped being afraid. "Purge line 3, seal 4, ready auxiliary pump." The crew moved in rhythm now, no hesitation, no jokes. Just focus. Each valve turned sounded like a gun cocking. Pressure climbed, 940, 980, 10, psi. The weld groaned under strain. One wrong move and it could burst, taking the whole team with it, but Cornfield kept going. "She'll hold," he muttered. "She has to." Above deck, the sonar pings quickened closer now. The Japanese sub had locked them. The captain stood on the bridge, eyes on the dark waves. Somewhere beneath that black water, a torpedo was already loading. Down below, the auxiliary pump roared to life. Cornfield rerouted steam flow through the secondary conduits. The same trick he'd used years ago on a broken grain dryer. Improvised engineering born in a barn saving a warship. The pressure surged another 20 psi every minute. 1060 and rising, shouted the chief. "Good." Cornfield snapped at 11. 100, punch it hard to port. On deck, the helmsman gripped the wheel. The second hand on the stopwatch ticked past 4 minutes. The radar ping became constant. Then the sonar man whispered, torpedo in the water. Cornfield didn't stop. He turned the last valve, slammed the wrench down, and yelled now. The engine screamed, turbines howling like wild beasts. Steam blasted through the vents, rattling every bolt in the hull. The cruiser lunged forward, metal shrieking, water exploding off her bow. Up above, the torpedo sliced through the spot they'd just vacated, missing by meters. The sea erupted behind them in a white geyser. The shockwave rolled through the ship, knocking men to their knees, but the hull held. They were alive. Later, the sub-commander would write, they moved like ghosts. Dead one moment, vanished the next. Cornfield exhaled, body trembling. The ship's heartbeat was back. But beneath that victory, he could already hear it. The tiny metallic pop of a new crack, forming somewhere deep inside the turbine. When the blast faded, silence fell over the ship, a heavy, disbelieving silence. Men looked at each other, faces streaked with soot and salt, realizing they were still alive. The captain's voice came through the intercom, hoarse but steady. Good work down there. It wasn't loud, but in that moment it felt like a medal. Cornfield slumped against the bulkhead, chest pounding. The chief engineer handed him a flask of lukewarm water. You just saved 800 men, he said quietly. The words didn't sink in. Cornfield just nodded, eyes still fixed on the trembling gauges. He didn't celebrate, he listened, always listening for the sound of the next failure. The same officers who'd laughed at him, called him tractor boy, Cornfield, grease monkey, and now stared at him with something close to reverence. One even muttered, should have made him chief before the war. For 17 straight hours, the ship crawled forward on Cornfield's jury. Rigged weld. Men slept on the floor beside the engine, afraid to leave their stations. The weld, his farm fix, had become the heartbeat of the cruiser. In the mess hall, someone taped a note on the wall. Cornfield's law, when it breaks, fix it like it's your last day on Earth. It wasn't a joke anymore, it was gospel. The ship's log would later summarize it coldly. Improvised flange repair sustained operation. No casualties. But within the crew, a legend was being written. A captured German engineer, after inspecting the ship post, would mutter in disbelief, their machines are patched with belief. He wasn't wrong. That belief, raw, unpolished, born of desperation, was what kept the cruiser alive when logic said it shouldn't. Cornfield sat on the engine room floor, grease covering his arms, staring at the patch he'd welded. The metal hummed faintly, alive but tired. He knew it couldn't last, pressures dropping. The chief whispered, glancing at the gauge. Cornfield didn't answer. He already knew. Every second was borrowed. Every turn of the propeller was a gamble. He wiped his hands on his coveralls, exhaling slow. Then we keep her alive 1 more hour, he said. We can't fix it again. But deep in the hull, under the roar and rhythm, came a faint metallic crack. The second breakdown had begun midnight. The Pacific sky above was starless, the kind of darkness that swallowed sound. Down below, the engine room had become an underworld of noise and heat. The vibration changed first, a low, irregular tremor underfoot. Then came the shudder, the warning every engineer fears. Cornfield's eyes snapped open. He'd been dozing against the valve casing, wrench still in hand. Now the hull was shaking again, harder each second. She's splitting. The chief engineer yelled. Sparks shot from the junction box. Men scrambled to grab fire blankets, but the smell hit first. Hot metal, oil, and ozone. The weld was cracking open. He dove forward, rolling under the piping maze, flashlight beam cutting through steam. The crack had spread like a lightning bolt down the brass joint he'd patched. No coolant, no spare plates, no time. Cut power to turbine 1. We can't. She'll die completely. Cornfield ignored them. Do it anyway, he barked, voice like steel. His tone silenced the chaos. The ship slowed, her heartbeat faltering. The air temperature climbed, 42 degrees C, maybe higher. Sweat stung his eyes, lungs filling with vapor. Oxygen levels were dropping. One man collapsed. Another kept working without missing a beat. The floor was slick, boots sliding on condensation and oil. Cornfield jammed a crowbar into the joint, prying it open further. The sound was monstrous metal screaming like it knew it was dying. He needed to see how bad it was. He wiped the flashlight lens and peered closer. The gasket he'd made from melted brass had fractured clean through. For a second he just stared, exhaustion pressed down like gravity. His hands were shaking. "We're out of patches," muttered the chief. "This is it." Cornfield didn't answer. He was somewhere else back in Iowa, his father's voice echoing in his head. "If the part won't hold, don't fix the part, fix the problem." That memory cut through the panic like a blade. He dropped the crowbar, grabbed a coil of wire mesh from the tool rack, and shouted, "We're doing this my way." The crew froze. "Your way?" He grinned, teeth gleaming through soot. "Yeah, farm way." And as the ship rolled beneath them, he began building something no naval textbook had ever described. Cornfield worked like a man possessed. His movements quick, precise, almost mechanical. He grabbed the wire mesh, standard cargo reinforcement, wrapped it tight around the fractured joint, and smeared it with engine oil until it gleamed black. Then, from the corner, he pulled a pressure valve line meant for waste vents. To everyone else, it looked like junk. To him, it was a lifeline. "Hand me the clamps," he ordered. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of someone who'd stopped asking permission. The chief passed them wordlessly. Every man nearby could feel it. Something rare was happening. He twisted the valve into the cracked flange using the oil-soaked mesh as a gasket. The smell was brutal burnt grease, salt, and desperation. The idea shouldn't have worked. It was a trick meant for tractors in muddy fields, not a U.S. Navy cruiser adrift in the Pacific. But Cornfield didn't care about theory. He cared about pressure. "Heat it up," he said. They reignited the torches, flame flaring gold against the steel walls. He sealed the mesh edges with molten brass, watching as the mixture hardened into something jagged but airtight. Then he stepped back, face glistening, eyes fixed on the gauge. Seconds crawled, the dial quivered, then started to rise. Slowly, steadily, 900, 950, 1000, sigh. "Come on, girl," he whispered, hand pressed against the turbine casing. The vibration changed, a softer hum, confident, alive, pressure stable. Someone yelled. The room erupted in exhausted laughter. Cornfield just smiled faintly, too tired to cheer. His barn fix had done the impossible. The cruiser moved again. 10 knots, then 12. Against all odds, she was alive for the second time. Reports indicate she ran like that for 48 straight hours, limping her way toward Pearl Harbor. When dock engineers opened her turbines later, they stared in disbelief. A field gasket, made of wire mesh and farm oil, had survived open ocean strain. A post-war Japanese report would state, "Their simplicity defeats our precision." It wasn't poetry, it was analysis. Cornfield sat by the engine, soot, streaked and smiling, the Pacific light filtering through the vents above. He'd beaten physics with a memory from home. Weeks later, naval engineers would dissect his repair to study how it held. None could explain it completely, but they all agreed it shouldn't have worked. When the USS Helena finally limped into Pearl Harbor, her hull streaked with salt and smoke, no band was waiting. No ceremony, just a dock crew staring in disbelief at the miracle that had floated in. The ship's log read one sterile line, "Temporary repair successful. Arrived under own power." But in the engine room, 800 men knew better. Cornfield stood by the rail as they anchored, uniform stiff with soot, eyes hollow but alive. The captain approached quietly, holding out his hand. "You kept us breathing," he said. Cornfield shook it once, nodded, and went back to cleaning his tools. That was his victory speech. In the days that followed, engineers tore apart his repair, tracing every weld, every patch. The wire mesh, oil gasket, and rerouted valve shouldn't have lasted an hour. Yet it endured 2 days of open sea strain. They documented it, tested it, and eventually gave it a name, Field Gasket Protocol. Within a year, that improvised technique appeared in the Navy's repair manual, quietly inserted, no credit given. But sailors whispered who'd done it. Cornfield's fix, they called it. 6 other cruisers would later survive breakdowns using that same idea. Cornfield never sought medals. When the war ended, he went home to Iowa, to the silence of the fields he once left behind. Neighbors said he rarely spoke about the Navy. When asked what he did out there, he'd just smile and say, kept something running. Decades later, a faded Navy report resurfaced in an archive. Scrawled in the margin beside a photo of his welded turbine were 4 words in pencil. Farmboy saved the fleet. Across the ocean, a former Japanese officer interviewed in 1962 summed it up bluntly. The war was won by those who refused to wait for orders. That line could have been written for Cornfield. The man who'd been mocked for fixing tractors ended up influencing how the world's largest navy thought about survival. Not through theory, through grit, instinct, and the stubborn belief that nothing stays broken if you care enough to rebuild it. And somewhere in a farm shed back in Iowa, the smell of oil and metal still lingered like a memory refusing to fade.